In March 1997, police officers entered a mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, California. What they found inside would become one of the most disturbing scenes in American history. 39 bodies, arranged neatly, lying on bunk beds and mattresses, each one covered with a purple shroud pulled up to their shoulders, each one wearing black clothing, each one wearing brand new Nike sneakers. On their arms, an armband that read, "Heaven's Gate Away Team." There was no sign of violence, no forced entry, no struggle. They had all chosen to be there. They had all chosen to leave, because they believed, with absolute certainty, that a spaceship was waiting for them. Hiding in the tail of the Hale-Bopp comet, passing close to Earth at that exact moment, and that their physical bodies were simply containers, vehicles they no longer needed. This is the story of Heaven's Gate, a story about faith and manipulation, about loneliness and belonging, about how ordinary people, educated people, kind people, people with families and dreams, can be led to the edge of everything they know and convinced to step off. It is not a story about crazy people. That is the most important thing you need to understand before we go further. It is a story about us, about the fundamental human need to believe in something larger than ourselves, and about what happens when someone learns to exploit that need with terrifying precision. To understand Heaven's Gate, you need to understand the man at its center. Marshall Applewhite was not what you imagine when you picture a cult leader. He was not wild-eyed or obviously unhinged. He was not charismatic in the way of fire and brimstone preachers or political demagogues. He was soft-spoken, deliberate. He had the calm, measured demeanor of a professor explaining a difficult but ultimately comprehensible concept. He was born in 1931 in Spur, Texas. His father was a Presbyterian minister. Marshall grew up intelligent, musically gifted. He studied philosophy and music, earned a master's degree, built a career as a choir director and music teacher. He had a wife. He had children. He appeared, by every external measure, to be a man living a conventional and successful life. But underneath that surface, something was fracturing. Applewhite was gay, a fact he found deeply incompatible with his religious upbringing and the expectations of his era. He struggled with that incompatibility in silence for years, in the way that people of his generation were forced to struggle with things that could not be named. And then, everything started to break. His marriage ended. He lost his teaching position at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, reportedly due to a relationship with a male student. He drifted. He experienced what he would later describe as a spiritual crisis that brought him to the edge of psychological collapse. In 1972, he was admitted to a psychiatric hospital in Houston, and it was there, or shortly after, that he met the woman who would change everything. Her name was Bonnie Nettles. She was a nurse. She was married with 4 children. She was deeply interested in astrology, mysticism, and theosophy, the kind of spiritual searching common in the early 1970s counterculture. When Applewhite and Nettles met, something ignited between them that neither could fully explain. Not romance, exactly. Something stranger, something more consuming. They became convinced, almost immediately, that they had known each other in previous existences, that they had a shared cosmic destiny, that they had been brought together for a purpose that transcended ordinary human understanding. Within months, Nettles had left her family, and the two of them had set off together to find out what that purpose was. This is where it gets dangerous. What followed was years of wandering. Applewhite and Nettles traveled across America, reading voraciously, discussing endlessly, building a theology that combined Christianity, science fiction, and New Age mysticism into something entirely their own. Their central idea was this: Jesus had not been what Christianity claimed he was. Jesus had been an alien, a being from a more evolved level of existence, what they called the next level, who had come to Earth in a human body to teach humanity how to transcend its physical limitations. The resurrection was not metaphor, it was literal. Jesus had shed his human container and returned to his spacecraft, and he was coming back, not in glory and judgment, but in the way of a teacher returning to collect students who had completed their coursework. Applewhite and Nettles believed, and hold the weight of this, they believed that they themselves were the two witnesses described in the book of Revelation, that they had been sent to prepare humanity for the next stage of its evolution. They began calling themselves Bo and Peep, later T and Do, but the core identity never changed. Two cosmic beings in temporary human form, on a mission to gather souls ready to leave the Earth behind. In 1975, they held a meeting in Waldport, Oregon. 20 people attended, expecting a lecture about UFOs. They left having given up their lives to follow two strangers into the wilderness. This was the beginning of Heaven's Gate. The early years were nomadic and brutal. The group moved constantly across the American West, camping in forests, sleeping in tents, surviving on donations. They had no fixed address, no public presence, no institutional structure. They also had no UFO. Bo and Peep had told their followers that a spaceship was coming, that dates were approaching, that the departure was imminent. The dates passed. The spaceship did not arrive. And this is where it changes, because in any rational analysis, this should have been the end. The prophecy failed. The believers should have walked away. What actually happened was the opposite. When a prophecy fails, documented case after documented case shows the same pattern. Believers double down. They find explanations for why the ship didn't come. They find new meaning in the failure itself. They become more committed, not less. Because the cognitive dissonance of abandoning a belief you have organized your entire life around is more psychologically painful than finding a reason to maintain it. Heaven's Gate members had given up jobs, families, bank accounts, everything they owned. To admit they had been wrong would be to admit that they had destroyed their lives for nothing, so they found ways not to admit it. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the group evolved. Bonnie Nettles, T, died of cancer in 1985. This was a crisis. If T and Do were immortal beings from the next level, how could Ty die? Applewhite's answer was characteristic of how he processed every challenge to the group's theology. He incorporated it. T had completed her mission on Earth and returned to the next level ahead of schedule. Her death was not a failure. It was a promotion. And then it got worse. After Nettles died, Applewhite became more controlling, more extreme. The group adopted increasingly strict rules. Members wore androgynous clothing. They cut their hair short regardless of gender. They were encouraged to see themselves as genderless beings, souls temporarily inhabiting bodies that didn't really belong to them. Several male members, including Applewhite himself, voluntarily underwent castration. This was not coercion in the legal sense. These were adults making choices. But they were making those choices inside an environment that had been systematically constructed to make those choices feel not just acceptable, but inevitable. They had been separated from their families. They had been taught that the world outside the group was hopelessly corrupted. They had been told that their only path to salvation was to follow Do with absolute fidelity. The psychological term for this process is thought reform. Though that term is insufficient, it suggests something done to passive victims. What actually happens is more complex, more collaborative, more seductive. This shouldn't have worked, and yet it did. To understand why, you need to understand what Heaven's Gate actually offered. Because it did offer something real, something that millions of people who never encountered Heaven's Gate are still searching for. Community, belonging, certainty, purpose. In the 1970s and 1980s, American culture was undergoing profound disruption. Traditional structures of meaning, religion, community, family, were fracturing under the pressures of rapid social change. Many people found themselves adrift, searching for something that felt true and larger than themselves. Heaven's Gate provided that. Completely, unconditionally, without ambiguity. In the group, you knew exactly who you were. You knew exactly why you were here. You knew exactly what you needed to do. And you were surrounded by people who shared your certainty and reinforced it daily. The people who joined Heaven's Gate were not weak or stupid. They included a former seminary student, a successful business person, a computer programmer, a concert violinist, people with college degrees, professional careers, close family relationships before the group consumed them. What they shared was not intellectual deficiency, it was hunger. A hunger for meaning and connection that the culture around them was failing to satisfy. Applewhite was extraordinarily skilled at identifying that hunger, and extraordinarily skilled at feeding it in ways that created total dependency. He didn't need to physically restrain people. He had built a belief system so totalizing that leaving felt equivalent to choosing damnation. Those outside the group weren't seen as people with valid perspectives. They were souls trapped in the illusions of a doomed planet. Their concern wasn't wisdom, it was spiritual blindness, and so the warnings from outside never fully penetrated. By the early 1990s, Heaven's Gate had developed a sophisticated media operation. They produced videotapes. They created websites. They were early and enthusiastic adopters of the Internet, which they saw as a tool for spreading their message to souls ready to receive it. The videos are extraordinary documents. Applewhite sits calmly in front of a camera and speaks for hours about the next level, about the alien civilization that created human life as an experiment, about the vehicles, the bodies, that souls inhabit temporarily, about the imminent arrival of a spacecraft. He is not raving. He is not screaming. He is calm, measured. He sounds like a man explaining something that seems, to him, entirely reasonable. And that calmness is one of the most disturbing things about the recordings, because it forces a question that is genuinely difficult to answer. Did Marshall Applewhite believe what he was saying? The evidence suggests that he did, that whatever process had produced his theology, the psychological crisis of the early 1970s, the years of isolation, the gradual construction of a world where his interpretation of reality was the only one his community could access, had produced in him a genuine, lived conviction. He was not a con man performing a part. He was a man who had convinced himself completely, and then spent 3 decades convincing everyone around him, which, in some ways, makes what happened in March 1997 more disturbing, not less. The Hale-Bopp comet was discovered in 1995, visible to the naked eye beginning in late 1996, one of the brightest comets of the 20th century. Astronomers and amateur stargazers around the world marveled at it. For Heaven's Gate, it was something else entirely. In late 1996, a Houston astronomer named Chuck Schramek posted an image online claiming to show a large object trailing the comet. He described it as a Saturn-like object, much larger than Earth, following Hale-Bopp toward the inner solar system. The claim was almost immediately debunked. The object was a background star. It had a catalog designation. It was well documented and entirely unremarkable. But the debunking did not reach Heaven's Gate, or rather, it reached them, and it was dismissed. Professional astronomers were part of the corrupted establishment. Their dismissals were exactly what you would expect from people invested in keeping humanity from learning the truth. What Heaven's Gate heard was the original claim, a spacecraft, following the comet, coming to Earth. Applewhite announced to his followers that the time had come. The spacecraft behind Hale-Bopp was the next-level vessel they had been waiting for. 22 years of preparation were complete. It was time to leave their vehicles behind. What followed was methodical and calm in a way that is almost impossible to comprehend from the outside. Members recorded farewell videos. They were composed, even cheerful. They spoke of looking forward to what was coming. They said goodbye to family members they hadn't spoken to in years, with the same effect you might use to say goodbye before a long trip. They purchased the phenobarbital. They prepared the purple shrouds. They arranged the mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, rented from its owner, paid several months in advance. The suicides happened in 3 waves over 3 days, March 24th to March 26th, 1997. The first group of 15 died on March 24th. A smaller group died the following day. The final group, including Applewhite himself, died on March 26th. Each person ingested phenobarbital mixed with applesauce or pudding, washed down with vodka. They then lay down and placed plastic bags over their heads. After each wave, the surviving members cleaned the space, arranged the bodies, pulled the purple shrouds over them, then prepared their own portions. The last 2 members had to do this alone, without the psychological reinforcement of community, knowing exactly what awaited them. They did it anyway. 39 people chose this. The group was discovered on March 26th, when a former member received a package in the mail. Rio D'Angelo had left Heaven's Gate relatively recently, but still maintained contact. The package contained farewell videotapes and instructions to alert the media. D'Angelo drove to Rancho Santa Fe and entered the mansion. He found the first bodies. He did not call 911 immediately. He left, called a friend, filmed some of what he had seen. This has been the subject of considerable controversy. D'Angelo has said he was in shock, that he needed to process what he was experiencing before he could act. Eventually, 911 was called. When deputies arrived, they found 39 bodies in various states of decomposition. The first group had been dead for 3 days. The investigation that followed was thorough and brief. No evidence of foul play, no evidence of coercion. The medical examiner ruled each death a suicide. 39 people had chosen this, which is exactly what makes it so hard to understand, and so important to try. In the days and weeks after the discovery, media coverage was intense and almost entirely wrong. The imagery was so striking, the Nike sneakers, the purple shrouds, the spaceship behind the comet, that coverage focused on spectacle rather than substance. The question asked over and over in slightly different forms: how could anyone believe something so obviously crazy? This is the wrong question, because the implicit assumption embedded in it, that the people who believed were somehow deficient, that they lacked the critical thinking that would have protected them, is not supported by the evidence. Robert Lifton, the psychiatrist who wrote the foundational text on thought reform, identified 8 criteria for what he called ideological totalism, the conditions under which a belief system gains total control over an individual's thought and behavior. Those criteria include milieu control, the control of the environment in which a person thinks; mystical manipulation, experiences that seem to confirm the group's special status; demand for purity, a sharp division between the pure in-group and the corrupt out-group; sacred science, doctrine established as absolute truth that cannot be questioned; loading the language, specialized vocabulary that shapes thought in ways the believer may not be aware of; doctrine over person, personal experience subordinated to the requirements of the ideology. Heaven's Gate met every single one of these criteria, and the research suggests that virtually anyone, under the right circumstances, is susceptible to a system that meets them. The circumstances matter enormously. People in transition, leaving a relationship, losing a job, experiencing a spiritual crisis, are more vulnerable. People who feel the mainstream culture around them is failing to provide meaning are more vulnerable, not because they are weak, but because the need that groups like Heaven's Gate exploit is universal. The need to belong, the need to matter, the need to understand why we are here. There is a particular cruelty in what happened to the families of Heaven's Gate members. They had spent years, in many cases more than 2 decades, watching their children, siblings, parents drift away, unable to reach them, unable to make contact in any way that penetrated the wall of the group's belief. Some had given up. Some had maintained a desperate, one-sided connection, sending letters, leaving messages that were never returned. When the news broke in March 1997, they learned not only that their loved ones were dead, they learned that their loved ones had died happy, at peace, convinced they were embarking on the greatest adventure imaginable. How do you grieve that? Sister Prudence Frisbee, whose brother Thomas Nichols was among the dead, described the particular torture of that knowledge. Thomas had been a member of Heaven's Gate for more than 20 years. He had left a promising career, a family, a life. In his farewell video, he was laughing. He looked happy, Frisbee said, and that was almost the worst part. Marshall Applewhite died with his followers. This matters. Unlike many cult leaders who have led followers to death, Jim Jones, David Koresh, Applewhite did not exempt himself from the fate he prescribed for his group. He took the same mixture. He lay down the same way. He was found, like the others, arranged neatly under a purple shroud, wearing Nike sneakers, with the same expression of calm that characterized every body in that house. Whether this makes him more or less culpable is a question without a clean answer. He destroyed 38 lives along with his own. He did it, apparently, in good faith, which is a profoundly disturbing thing to say, but it may be the most accurate thing that can be said. 2 people survived, not in the sense of leaving before the deaths. They were not present in Rancho Santa Fe. 2 former members who had left some years earlier received the packages. They spoke to media in the immediate aftermath. But more extraordinarily, they have continued, in the years since, to maintain the Heaven's Gate website. The website is still online. All the videos, all the written materials, all the theology, presented not as artifacts of a tragedy, but as living truth, as a message left behind for souls who might still be ready to receive it. Mark King, who goes by his group name, has said in interviews that he considers himself still a member of Heaven's Gate, that he believes Du and the others completed their journey, that they are on the next level. Now, he does not consider what happened in Rancho Santa Fe to be a tragedy. He considers it a graduation. This is not presented here as an endorsement. It is presented because it illustrates something essential about the architecture of belief. The evidence that shattered faith for the outside world, 39 bodies in a mansion in California, was not, for someone inside Heaven's Gate's belief system, evidence against the theology. It was evidence for it. The spacecraft came. Du and the others graduated. The next level is real. That the rest of the world sees only 39 dead people is itself proof of how spiritually blind the rest of the world is. This is the closed loop of totalist belief. There is no evidence that can penetrate it from outside, because the system has defined every possible counter-evidence as further confirmation of its own truth. In the years since 1997, Heaven's Gate has become cultural shorthand for a particular kind of radical credulity. The Nike sneakers, the purple shrouds, the comet, the phrase away team. There have been documentaries, podcasts, academic studies, journalistic investigations. The case appears in psychology courses, sociology courses, theology courses. But there is a risk in all that cultural processing. The risk that familiarity produces comfortable distance. A feeling that Heaven's Gate was a strange artifact of a particular moment. That the specific combination of factors, the post-counterculture spiritual searching of the 1970s, the early internet that allowed the group to spread its message while maintaining isolation, the particular psychology of one damaged and brilliant man, was unique, unrepeatable. And then it gets worse. Because the conditions that made Heaven's Gate possible are not historical curiosities. They are present, in different forms, in every era. Every period of rapid social change produces people searching for certainty. Every communication technology can be used to build isolated information environments. Every human community contains people whose need for belonging and meaning is not being met by the mainstream culture around them. And in every era, there are people willing and able to exploit those needs. The Internet, that Heaven's Gate used in the 1990s, has become, in the decades since, an ecosystem of far greater complexity and reach, one that has enabled the construction of closed information worlds at a scale Applewhite could never have imagined. The mechanisms of thought reform that Lifton identified are not less relevant now. They have found new applications, new contexts, new vocabularies. Heaven's Gate is not a warning from the past. It is a warning about the present. There is a final image worth sitting with. In the farewell videos recorded in the days before their deaths, person after person speaks directly to the camera with expressions of genuine peace. They are not performing. The videos were not intended for public consumption. They were intended for souls who would understand, for people like themselves, watching after the group had departed, wondering what had happened and why. A woman named Gail, who joined the group in the 1970s and spent more than 20 years inside it, looks at the camera and says she has no regrets. She is grateful. She is excited. She says goodbye to her family with the warmth of someone running slightly late for a flight. She was 48 years old. She had been part of Heaven's Gate for more than half her life. And in that final video, she is not a victim. She is not someone who needs to be rescued. She is someone who believes, with every fiber of her being, that she is about to begin the greatest adventure of all possible lives. That certainty, the peace on her face, the calm in her voice, is the most haunting part of the entire story. Because it forces the question that no easy narrative about cults can answer. What is the difference between faith and delusion? Between conviction and manipulation? Between a belief that saves you and a belief that destroys you? There are answers. The answers involve the degree to which belief is freely chosen and can be freely revised, the degree to which it serves the believer or serves the believer's leader, the degree to which it opens a person to the world or closes them off from it. But those answers are not always obvious in the moment. They were not obvious to the 39 people who lay down in Rancho Santa Fe in March 1997, pulled purple shrouds over their shoulders, and waited for a spacecraft that never came. Heaven's Gate is still out there. The website is still up. The videos are still playing. And somewhere, someone is watching them for the first time tonight, searching for the same thing that Gail and Thomas and Marshall and all the others were searching for. Meaning, belonging. The sense that their existence matters in some larger story. That search is not pathological. That search is human. What happens to it, where it leads, who it leads to, depends on forces that are not always in our control. But understanding those forces, understanding how belief forms and how it can be exploited, how community can become a cage and certainty can become a weapon, is the beginning of something, not immunity. Nothing guarantees immunity, but awareness. And awareness, sometimes, is enough. This is the U.S. Dominance Archive. We don't do surface-level stories here. We go into the structure of things, the mechanism, the why behind the what. Heaven's Gate is not a story about crazy people who believed in UFOs. It is a story about the architecture of belief, about the human need that cults exploit and the human vulnerability that makes exploitation possible, about how intelligence and education and kindness are no protection against a system designed, with sufficient sophistication, to capture exactly those qualities. It is a story that is still happening, in different forms, with different theologies, in different corners of the Internet and the world. The spacecraft behind the comet was never real. But the need that made people believe in it is as real as anything in human experience. Subscribe to the channel and drop a comment below. What do you think makes people vulnerable to belief systems like Heaven's Gate? And what, if anything, do you think actually protects people from them? I want to read your thoughts. See you next time.